Welcome to this Fathom podcast. My name is Alan Johnson. I'm the editor of Fathom. Today I'm with Caleb Bendo, who's the deputy editor of Fathom, and we're delighted to welcome Alexander Yakobson. Alexander is an Israeli historian, a professor of ancient history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He co-wrote an excellent book, Israel and the Family of Nations, the Jewish Nation State and Human Rights, with former Israeli Minister Amnon Rubinstein. He's a regular contributor to Haaretz and many other publications. Today, we're going to be exploring Israel's war in Gaza and in Lebanon. And we're going to be looking at a controversy between Michael Walzer, whom we interviewed recently on Fathom. You'll see the link below if you scroll down on the website, and Alexander regarding largely the conduct of Israel's wars. So let's start with that controversy and just jump right in there, Alexander. So Michael Walzer argued in the New York Times and in his interview with Fathom that the pager attacks on Hezbollah operatives were, in his words, war crimes and terrorist attacks. His reasoning was multiple, but I think his central arguments were firstly that the IDF had failed to respect the distinction between combatants and civilians, a distinction which he argued quite rightly is central to the conduct of a just war. Secondly, he said, if we think by analogy, if IDF soldiers had been targeted in a similar way, we would not have hesitated in calling it terrorism. So his implication was this kind of hypocrisy that we don't call it such when it's an Israeli attack upon Hezbollah operatives. So yourself and Asar Gat wrote a very sharply critical response in Real Clear Politics, the top line of which was that you claimed Walzer's suggested rules of engagement were every terrorist's paradise. So can we jump right in there and tell us why you objected so sharply to Michael's argument and his conclusions?
Well, first of all, it's obvious that this operation was more targeted than most operations, than is usually possible if you fight a terrorist or guerrilla force that operates among civilians. It was the pager operation, was in a much more specific way targeted directly against enemy combatants with less risk of collateral damage and less actual collateral damage involved than is usually possible when you are fighting someone who fights among civilians. Now, that is obvious. The Hezbollah have claimed that there were thousands of wounded in this operation and dozens of killed. That is not the usual ratio in a military operation by a huge margin. And the reason, obviously, is that the power of the explosion was limited. The pagers, they exploded in such a way that most of the direct victims were wounded rather than killed. The overwhelming majority were merely wounded. That means that people who are in the close proximity would usually not be hurt. That is, by the way, I don't know if it was inevitable given the technical situation, or it was a deliberate decision to limit the power of it. Maybe it was possible to do it in a more powerful way. In any case, that meant that not only were most people not killed, but many of the wounded were lightly wounded. Some of Hezbollah operatives were actually soon after that killed in a bombing, because Hezbollah admitted that people who were wounded in this operation already released from hospital, that is to say they were lightly wounded, and went back to their activities. So I would argue that Azar Gat and I, we argued that this is a exceptionally clean operation from the only relevant viewpoint, really morally relevant viewpoint, how far you make an effort and if you can succeed in limiting your attack to actual combatants, to Hezbollah operatives, because nobody in Lebanon was using those outdated pagers except Hezbollah operatives, and if anyone was using, they were the only ones that were compromised. Now, what Michael Walzer has nevertheless argued is that this was what was wrong. He admits that these were legitimate military targets, the operatives targeted, but he says it was wrong to target them in a non-military setting, in a civilian setting, which endangers surrounding civilians. And he draws an analogy with soldiers that can be attacked on the battleground or in a military base, even if they are resting, but in a military base, but not when they are on leave outside the military framework. So the demand is that there should be not just should be aimed at Hamas of Hezbollah operatives, but these operatives should then be acting in a military setting. The problem with this argument, the fundamental problem with this argument, is that there is no such thing as a military camp of Hezbollah that is not among civilians. There is no military bases or military units of Hezbollah that can be attacked in such a way that they are not among civilians. So the real choice is, the two possibilities are either you attack them in a civilian setting, or you attack them in a mixed setting. Not in a civilian, not in a purely, there is no, almost virtually 100% of cases. This is a mixed setting that in practice means that they are firing rockets from between civilian buildings, or they are storing rockets. They will soon be fired in the basement of civilian or under civilian, in the densely populated areas and things like that. So if there is a possibility to attack a terrorist, to target a terrorist in a civilian setting, as it was done in this case, but in such a way that you can make sure that the collateral damage is limited, much more limited than is usually the case. It is certainly preferable from the moral point of view to attacking that terrorist in a setting that he recognizes as legitimate, that is in an allegedly military setting that is in fact always or almost always a mixed setting, and then you kill a lot of civilians. This is what we do when we have to go out of them when they're actually fighting or on their way to fighting. And this is what the United States has many times done as part of the war on terror. So this demand that a terrorist should be in a military setting rather than in a non-military setting ignores the fact that a terrorist military setting inevitably, almost inevitably, involves endangering, from his point of view, civilians, and from our point of view, of course, killing a lot of civilians in order to then extinguish that fire, to attack the terrorist at that point. Now, I will take up the challenge of Israeli soldiers attacked by the other side. What are the jus in bello rules from the terrorist point of view? Now, if you want to fight the IDF, if you want to fight the IDF as we want to fight Hezbollah, you don't need to give pagers to soldiers. There are plenty of military targets all over the country that can be attacked. But a more serious challenge is to talk about a soldier. What about an Israeli soldier in a civilian setting, on leave? As anyone knows who has been to Israel, the Israeli streets are full of soldiers in uniform. And this is a civilian setting. If you attack an Israeli soldier in uniform, so there is no doubt that he is a soldier, maybe armed, that was the case in uniform, in the street in Jerusalem, just outside where I live. And this is by the yardstick that he is using, this is a civilian setting. But I would say, imagine that Hamas, it's ridiculous even to talk about it, given what they actually do, but if Hamas decided that its policy would be to attack Israeli soldiers in the street, in a civilian setting, on leave, not in a military base, but in such a way that they would make an effort to limit their attacks to the soldiers, to avoid civilian casualties as much as possible, although it is not always possible. But imagine that Hamas would have a policy of attacking Israeli soldiers in a civilian setting while doing their best to avoid civilian casualties. Well, you know, every Israeli shudders at such a thought of soldier attacked in the street. And of course, this is terrorism under Israeli law and under the law of any other country. But if you want to construct jus in bello rules for let's call them then urban guerrillas, then of course this is an action of urban guerrillas. This is not at all like blowing up buses and pizzerias and restaurants, which is what these guys are doing regularly. This is their favorite pastime. And if they were doing that, attacking soldiers in a targeted way, trying to avoid collateral damage, then their moral standing would be very different from what it is now. So I am taking, yes, I accept that even when it comes to the IDF, it doesn't really matter. Bad guys are. It's not that the bad guys are always right. Not at all. I don't. Even an army is not necessarily an army of good guys, but it always provides its enemies with a lot of military targets. But even if you attack an Israeli soldier in a civilian setting, but you do that in a targeted way, there is no comparison at all between this and the usual Palestinian and many other forms of terrorism. And you might well argue that this is legitimate in the sense that this is not a war, this is an act of war against the state of Israel or any other country, but it is not a war crime. It is not a war crime in the sense that the usual examples of Palestinian terrorism are war crimes. So I think that, yes, I think that even while it is the army is much more, in the case of an army, it makes a greater sense to say you should only attack soldiers in a military setting, because there are plenty of opportunities to attack soldiers in purely or more or less purely military settings. But even there, I would say that if what is important really is not the setting, but whether you are making your best effort to avoid civilian casualties. If you are going after the enemy where you can find them, or you are going after civilians, and if you ask what is more legitimate, to attack an Israeli soldier in the street in a targeted way, or to attack an Israeli soldier in a mixed setting, because that also happens. Of course, military people can also be in a place where, when attacked, you endanger civilians. That also happens, of course, to militaries, not just to terrorists. Clearly, it is preferable from the moral point of view to attack even soldiers of a regular army in a civilian setting while making an effort to avoid civilian casualties than to attack them in a mixed setting when you are sure to kill a lot of innocent civilians. Isn't that elementary common sense?
Okay, thank you, Alexander. Towards the end of Michael Walzer's interview, he suggested that Israel's war in Gaza, we're now 14 months in, is now unjust, because while Israel is inflicting huge damage to people and infrastructure within Gaza, Israel isn't proposing any way to finish the war. How do you respond to that claim?
Well, I wonder if he has not been listening to what the Biden administration has been saying, or that the Biden administration is saying that there is a proposal to end this war on the table that originally came from Mr. Netanyahu, but it was then adopted by President Biden in his speech, where he presented a detailed plan for ending the war. And the Biden administration is repeatedly saying, and they have said only recently, there was a White House spokesman who said only recently there is no agreement because Hamas has not accepted this plan. They are blaming Hamas. First of all, they say there is a proposal on the table, and Hamas has not accepted it. Now, there is an Israeli internal debate about many things, but nowadays, I think it's better, if you want to understand what's going on, not to listen to what Israelis are saying about each other, but what the Biden administration is saying. They cannot be suspected of being too sympathetic to Netanyahu. They don't like him. They don't trust him. They suspect that he's playing a double game. I also suspect that he, certainly in public, he is not admitting the extent of his concessions in those talks, but for political reasons, because of his horrible coalition. We know that. But they have never said, the Americans have never said, there is a proposal that Hamas is willing to accept, and it is not being implemented because the Israeli government because the prime minister is not willing to subscribe to what he had proposed, in fact, several months ago. They have never said that. They are either saying, they have said repeatedly, Hamas should take advantage of the generous Israeli offer of a truce, of putting an end to fighting, or they sometimes say both sides should make greater effort, meaning that they don't fully trust the present Israeli government. Nor do I. But to say that that the war is unjust because allegedly there is a way of putting an end to it, and we just don't want to put an end to it because we just want to fight on just for the fun of it. I don't believe at all that it is in Netanyahu's political interest to fight an endless war. That he wants to win the next Israeli election. And an endless war is not a recipe for winning the next election. There is a very economic cost to it. And even if he's totally cynical, of course politically he's totally cynical, but there is no. In any case, I mean, it's very strange. He can criticize, of course, there are plenty of reasons to criticize Netanyahu and suspect him. Maybe he's happy that Hamas has not accepted those proposals. Maybe he wishes them not to accept them. But there are proposals, and they are coming now they originated from Israel, coming from the American administration, and Hamas has never up to now been prepared to accept them. There is a very specific issue. There are all kinds of issues, and there is a fog, not just a fog of war, but a fog of diplomacy. And right now, I think there are greater efforts, and there are all kinds of indications that maybe there is some movement. But I don't know. Up to now, clearly there is one issue. What Hamas is clearly trying to achieve in those talks is a mechanism that would allow them to rebuild what we have destroyed. The real issue is not what else we can do by continuing the war, but whether we can prevent Hamas from rebuilding the quasi-state and the quasi-army that they have had in Gaza for 17 years. And what the Hamas is demanding, contrary to the Netanyahu-Biden proposal, that speaks of two stages. The first stage is ceasefire, and the ceasefire goes forever unless it's violated. It is not Netanyahu says he's not willing to end the war, but the proposals that he has accepted say that the fighting is over the moment there is a ceasefire. Then there is a partial exchange of prisoners, and then there are talks for the second stage, and the second stage has to create security guarantees. And only then, after the second stage, having negotiated the security guarantees, then Israel has to withdraw from the whole of the territory of the Gaza Strip. And he has committed to this. He is not admitting it, but that's part of the proposals. But the Hamas is asking for a total Israeli withdrawal. Now, under the proposal, there has to be withdrawal from populated areas, and then a full withdrawal. But the difference between first stage or second stage is not technical. What they are asking for, the reason why they are demanding an immediate and full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza before there are negotiated security arrangements is obviously that they want to start immediately rebuilding with massive Iranian help. They're not alone in that. This monstrous jihadi state, de facto state that they had created there, that carried out the 7th of October attack, they are anxious to start rebuilding it. This is why they want to control the border with Egypt, the Philadelphia and the Rafah crossing. Israel will not stay there, but Israel has undertaken to withdraw from there after there are security arrangements in place. Hamas is saying, go out now, we will go back there, and we will renew what had been happening there. We will start getting arms. We will work on it, assuming, yeah. So maybe there is some way of solving this problem before there is an Israeli withdrawal. If you judge Israel by the rhetoric, first of all, by the horrible rhetoric that comes from his partners, not just junior partners, but from Likud members, and from his own statements that say that he says we will not go, we refuse to leave the Philadelphia corridor. He's on record of saying that. But the proposals do commit Israel to that, but they do not commit Israel to doing that immediately before there is a viable security alternative. And I think that those who insist on I think Hamas at least, insist on this because they want to start rebuilding. And the American administration has never said up to now that Israeli demands at the talks contradict the original parameters. That has been alleged repeatedly in Israel as part of the Israeli political arguments. One has never heard it from the Biden administration. And I think the Biden administration should be trusted. At least I don't see why Michael Walzer should just ignore this aspect, as if this didn't exist, this whole thing.
Alexander, can I follow up and ask you, there's a lot of confusion amongst a lot of Israel's friends, I think, in the West as to what Israel wants after the war and what Israel sees as viable, as you put it, security arrangements or viable alternative security. It seems to me there's either you leave Hamas in place, which seems to have been ruled out, you want the PA to take over, which doesn't seem to be the case. You trust the international community to do so, which I don't think anybody does, or you see continued Israeli control of the Strip, which again, people have said that's not what's wanted. So I think there's a concern that without a political horizon that's being proposed by Israel, people are unsure how this war is supposed to end and what the post-war arrangements are supposed to look like. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is what you think is the case regarding the Israeli government, and also actually what you think should be the case.
Well, first of all, there are no good solutions for Gaza. That's a basic assumption. All alternatives are bad. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons. Actually, Netanyahu published memoirs shortly before 7th of October, and he writes that he had avoided retaking Gaza, conquering Gaza, and despite the tens of thousands of rockets that had been fired at Israel before October 7th, because he says, it is of course, it is a disaster to take Gaza, of course. Mm-hmm. But then what do you do with it? There is no good answer to the question, what do you do with it after you take it? Now, there is a difference between what Netanyahu speaks of is total victory. He has used the expression total victory and destroying Hamas. Both those expressions are responsible populistic slogans. There cannot be there should be a victory. There cannot be in a fight like that with a Islamist terrorist movement. There are no total victories, and Hamas cannot be destroyed, but the Hamas state and Hamas army should have been destroyed after the 7th of October, and to a large extent has been destroyed. So the problem when you formulate these unrealistic slogans, of course, and people get the impression that you want to fight forever. But if you look at the government decision, the cabinet decision, declaring the war, the aim is formulated in a much more reasonable way. The aim that's the official government decision. A resolution of the cabinet. It says the aim of the operation of the war, they called it a war, is to dismantle the governmental and military capabilities of Hamas. Obviously, Hamas was not acting in Gaza as a terrorist underground. It was acting as a terrorist army at the service of a jihadi government, of a de facto jihadi enemy state. That had to be destroyed because it proved a risk that we could no longer live with. And it has been to a large extent destroyed. We have destroyed Hamas as an army. We have not destroyed Hamas as a terrorist underground. It will continue be in Gaza as a terrorist argument for the foreseeable future. Now, what do you do in Gaza, given that there will be a terrorist threat from Gaza, but not a threat of thousands of rockets and not a threat of an invasion, because what happened on the 7th of October was not a terrorist infiltration. It was an invasion by thousands of fighters for which the Israeli army was not prepared because they could not think in such terms. But it was an invasion by a terrorist army, the aim of which was not to defeat Israel, not to conquer Israel, but to seize several Israeli settlements and to massacre their inhabitants. The massacre was the military victory which made them heroes, okay, in the Arab world, unfortunately. So we cannot tolerate the rebuilding of capabilities that existed prior to the 7th of October. Gaza can no longer be a jihadi state with a jihadi army. But it is unrealistic to say that there will not be a terrorist underground there. Now, in my view, what Israel should have said at the beginning of this war, that our aim is to replace the Hamas government with the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority should be the ones responsible. No, that doesn't. The Palestinian Authority did not dream of doing that before we militarily crushed Hamas. Anyone who says we should, instead of the war, we should have said, give Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. Hamas would not have given Gaza to the people who they were throwing from the roots, if you remember. And the Palestinian Authority doesn't dream of fighting them, of going there and taking over by force. You need first an Israeli military victory that is clear enough, and then an Israeli readiness to hand it over to the Palestinian Authority. Now, Netanyahu doesn't accept it for political reasons. It is true. He says they will not fight terrorism. Of course they will not. There is no chance that Palestinian Authority in Gaza will be able to fight the Hamas terrorists. But I think that there is a chance that the Palestinian Authority in Gaza will allow Israel to do what Israel is doing in the West Bank. When there is a terrorist threat, they act in some areas, they act against terrorism, in some areas they don't. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. When they don't, and when Israel sees that there is a threat, we go into areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and we do it ourselves, and the Palestinian security forces don't fight us. That's the big difference. You don't have to, you don't have to fight the PA forces when you carry out arrests in Jenin, and even military operations in Jenin. So the best scenario for Israel would be that there would be some kind, I would call it a Palestinian Authority if Netanyahu doesn't want to call it PA, it could be called the Gaza Arab Authority, okay? But it should be something like that, that will be controlling the area, hopefully will do something to preserve security and prevent the rebuilding of terrorist infrastructure. But I would not be too optimistic on that, but it would prevent, would leave the IDF, will not necessitate permanent Israeli military presence in Gaza, but will allow Israel will say, okay, either you do it, and then we're very happy to keep out of Gaza. Then you are de facto sovereign. If you don't do it, we go in and do it, and you don't fight us. This, by the way, maybe now there is a chance following the precedent that was established in Lebanon. If the Lebanese ceasefire now succeeds, the model is Israel withdraws, but the United States, it's not the Lebanese and not Hezbollah, but the American administration has now recognized for the first time that Israel, as part of its right of self-defense, has a right not only to fire when they fire at us, but if there is a military building, when they're building military capabilities, preparing for attacks, especially on the borders, all the Hezbollah fortifications that were now destroyed. If they are trying to rebuild it and they are preparing for attacks, and if the Lebanese army is not acting against it, which I very much doubt they will be able or willing to do, then there is an American acceptance of Israel's right to act alone, unilaterally, under the general definition of a right to self-defense, which is very reasonable. If you're attacked from a neighboring country, then of course it is the business of the government of that country to prevent it. If it doesn't do that, then you do it, and at least you have American support. I wonder if you will have European support. So maybe this idea of Israeli withdrawal and a recognized Israeli right to act if the local Arab authorities are not acting, maybe that's the best possible scenario.
Alexander, there's two kind of main accusations that have been made against Israel over the last year or so. One is that Israel's not waging a war, but actually is carrying out a genocide in Gaza. And that's been the mantra for more or less a year now in the West. And it's undeniably seeped into parts of Western consciousness as some sort of truth. Not that this is proof by any means, but I even think that Amnesty has also now come out with the genocide claim. In addition, there's another debate that's going on in the West, which regards humanitarian aid and whether Israel's doing enough to allow aid into Gaza, and whether Israel is kind of using starvation as an act of war. In your opinion, who's responsible for this holdup in the distribution of aid? Is UNRWA a legitimate UN agency? Is it a front for Hamas? Maybe it's both. There's claims of malnutrition, even starvation. Although COGAT, which is the coordinator of government activities in the territories, produced stats on how much aid Israel is sending into Gaza. So, what are your views on these two debates?
Well, clearly, huge quantities of humanitarian aid are getting into Gaza, and most of it is taken over by Hamas. But the Hamas is using them also to sustain their military, now I would say, an underground effort. We are actually forced to materially assist the terrorist organization. This is what we're doing. We know that the things that are getting into Gaza will end up in the hands of those who will use them for continuing the war. But that's inevitable unless you want people to starve. That's the result of it. That is an area controlled by jihadi forces that fight you. This is the meaning of it. This is why it should not be allowed to survive. Because if a jihadi government controls an area, there is no siege. The usual limits that you impose on a hostile entity, that inevitably means that you starve the people. And if things get through, then you feed the enemy. You may remember when there were sanctions against Iraq imposed by the Security Council, and things were getting in Iraq, but then the government would take over them and not distribute them to civilians. And I remember human rights organizations accusing Western governments acting with the sanction of the Security Council of the death of tens of thousands of Iraqi children. You remember the starving Iraqi children? The Iraqi children maybe was starving, but not if the rules imposed by the Security Council, if they were observed, nobody would need to starve. But there is no way you can tell a despotic government like that of Saddam Hussein or a Hamas government in Gaza how to distribute, how to use the food, and whether you will not sell it for a high price. Or just use it for your fighters to sustain your fighters in those tunnels. Now, when it comes to genocide and to massacre and to targeting civilians, if you want to be serious about it, the first thing to realize is that in a war like that, in Gaza, there is simply no such thing as a Hamas military target that is not among civilians. There is no military target that you can attack that is not among civilians. That's the nature of what they have created there for 17 years. And therefore, if you fight Hamas, you inevitably kill civilians, then people say you are massacring civilians because look how many civilians you've killed. The numbers can be debated. People, of course, take Hamas numbers for granted, and then they say all the numbers that Hamas are publishing, they're all civilians. Hamas doesn't claim that they're all civilians. They simply give numbers and don't distinguish between civilians and fighters. And you may have noticed that in Western press, the numbers are then proclaimed to be the numbers only of civilians, assuming that we have not killed a single Hamas fighter. That is the usual procedure. But look at the basic dilemma. Look, in a usual war, when you fight an army, most of the military targets of the enemy are not among civilians. In the Ukrainian war, most of the Russian, it's not a matter of good guys or bad guys. The Russian army in Ukraine is not, these are not good guys at all. But if you want to fight the Russian army in Ukraine, most of the military targets are purely, clearly military targets. Then in every war, there are also targets that are in the headquarters, the Ministry of Defense, the military industry, the communications, all the things that are in civilian areas. Sometimes they are double purpose. You can argue whether this is, energy and things like that. So there are real dilemmas of collateral damage. But there is always the main military effort is concentrated, is focused on fighting the military units of the enemy. Now, when you fight Hamas, there is simply no such thing, and more or less the same in Lebanon with Hezbollah. There is simply no such thing as a military target of the enemy that is outside a densely built-up civilian area. Now, what do? Take the example of rocket fire. Thousands of rockets were fired at Israel after October the 7th. And of course, tens of thousands of rockets had been fired at Israel during the Hamas rule in Gaza. Now, these are war crimes. They were fired totally indiscriminately. I think Hezbollah in some cases, they made an effort to target military targets. I think Hezbollah, Hamas was never interested. Now, if you want only to kill Israeli civilians, but you still want to spare your own civilians, then you fire those rockets from a relatively less populated areas in Gaza, because although Gaza is a small and densely populated area, there are still some relatively less rural areas from which you could, using those tunnels, because they're also effective fire at Ashdod or Sderot or Tel Aviv. Fine. But we know that these rockets were regularly fired from all over Gaza, including the most densely populated civilian areas in the Gaza City and in the refugee camps. And very often, not just from built-up areas, but from specifically, they would put those rockets near the most sensitive places, like the schools, in schools or around us or near a school or a hospital or a mosque, because rockets were stored in mosques, rockets were fired from near mosques. Now, how can you, how can you cope with something like that? And everybody knows, of course, that the main military resource of Hamas, their main source of power is, of course, this metro of underground tunnels that were right under the populated areas. How do you get there if you do not go through some way those areas? And of course, as in every urban area, when you get into an urban area, there is a street fighting. They fire from windows, from houses. In that sense, it's no different from any other urban area. But they also have strategic assault weapons that they fire from those places. And they also had, before the Israeli invasion, they had strategic capabilities of organizing thousands of fighters and sending them through the border in order to massacre, in order to attack. Then they also attacked military posts, but to take, they took over 20 civilian locations and they massacred in a horrendous way. They massacred their population. That was their main victory. That was their main achievement. Now, a jihadi state that regards this as its achievement, is, think of it, the 7th of October should have been considered a defeat by usual standards of fighting. Because if you invade the territory of a neighboring country and within a day or two, the invading forces wiped out and the enemy army goes back to the border. Never mind what happened later, but just the operation, just the 7th of October itself. Then by every usual standard, military standards, it's a defeat. Imagine that the German army would invade France in the 30s, would invade France, take over 20 villages and towns on the border, and within 2 days, the French army would wipe them out and go back to the border. I don't think the Nazi regime could survive this. This would have been considered a humiliating defeat. Why wasn't the 7th of October considered a humiliating defeat, but rather a glorious victory? Because a glorious thing was that during those 2 days, they succeeded in murdering more than 1,000 Israeli civilians and doing all the other things that they did. Now, that is a victory. Now, if you have an entity which regards such a feat as a military victory, then you can not afford to allow it to continue to exist. And those who say you have a right to defend yourself, but you have to do it without killing civilians or without killing many civilians, these are just empty words. They're completely meaningless. What they're actually telling us, you have no right to defend yourselves, because if you are trying to defend yourselves, and the only way you can defend yourselves under such conditions, we will say that this is genocide. And if we have time, I'm now thinking, if we are now in the business of analogies on both sides, imagine that there is an Arab army that is given the task of conquering Tel Aviv, God forbid. Now, speaking of genocide, I can imagine but let us imagine that they get strict orders to carry out this operation under the law, observing the laws of war, without any atrocities and trying to avoid civilian casualties as far as possible and without any atrocities, okay? Let's imagine that the Jordanian army is doing that, and it behaves more or less in a civilized way like the Arab Legion did in 48, by the way. So, okay, so imagine that, God forbid such a thing happens, and they succeed in doing that, and they're disciplined enough, because, you cannot control what every soldier does in a situation like that. But imagine that they are, by any reasonable standard, they have done it, they have carried out this civilized, jus in bello civilized, okay, order in a disciplined and organized way, and the greater Tel Aviv area, which is more or less comparable maybe with Gaza, maybe it's also something like that, 2 million people. Greater Tel Aviv has been conquered by an army that has been scrupulously, as far as possible, observing the rules of war against an Israeli force of course, one would imagine, of tens of thousands of Israeli fighting, desperately resisting them, of course, okay, by street fighting. Now, I would want to ask you, how do you imagine Tel Aviv would look, the greater Tel Aviv area, how would it look after being captured by a civilized, law-abiding Arab army against stiff Israeli resistance? I imagine it would look more or less like Gaza looks now, because it's totally inevitable. And that, by the way, tells you something very important. Because all the particularly barbaric Hamas methods of absolute recklessness towards its own civilians are only in addition to the basic problem that even if you are fighting an army that is not so cruel and indifferent to the fate of its own people like Hamas, as I want to hope that Israeli forces would have been, presumably. In any case, you have to, if you capture a city, a built-up area, by street fighting, by storm, against strong organized resistance, in any case, you destroy the city. Has it ever happened otherwise in the history of warfare? Of course. Capturing a built-up area is hell on earth for the civilians and for the army. So every army tries to avoid it. The closest analogy to Gaza is the Mosul, or there are several large Iraqi cities that were taken by Americans or by coalition forces from the terrorists who had taken over those cities. And sure enough, there were large spread destruction and thousands of civilians killed. But the difference is that Mosul, I think, had been, Mosul and Fallujah, both of them, I think, had been controlled by terrorists for months, or maybe a year, before they were taken over by the coalition, from ISIS or from other terrorists. Now, they had not the time or the means, because they were not getting massive outside support. They had not the time to entrench themselves among the civilian population on the ground and below the ground to anything like a similar extent. You see, if you want to understand what the war in Gaza means, you would need to imagine a Mosul or a Fallujah that was ruled by, say, an Islamic State for 17 years. All this time with massive support from Iran, arms and training, and billions of Qatari money, and all the international community giving humanitarian aid from which the terrorists would be then taking their taxes at will. They would, from all that aid, take what, the tunnels in Gaza were built by cement that was contributed not by Iran and not by Qatar. It passed through Israeli border. It was not smuggled. The cement was legally and openly brought into Gaza, and the Israeli government that was being accused of a cruel siege. You remember this cruel, that part of the cruel siege, that is the context that is supposed to have justified the 7th of October, the cruel siege. Now, as part of this cruel, inhumane siege, Israel allowed these huge quantities of cement to get into Gaza by trucks that were passing the Israeli border to the enemy state. Why? Because that was required in order to allow civilians to build their houses, destroyed during previous outbreaks of fighting provoked by rocket fire. Now, if Israel refused to allow Gaza civilians for years to rebuild their houses, it would have been accused of an even more cruel siege. Now, we allowed that in the full knowledge that they would be used for it. That was no secret. Everyone knew, it was widely published, that this cement that we are allowing for humanitarian reasons and under international pressure is being used by Hamas to build the tunnels. The difference is that we apparently were not aware of how extensive that network was, but everyone knew that those were the main military resource. And so the cruel siege was allowing them to do that. So imagine Mosul, where such a regime of a jihadi state that is being supported and supplied, and even the Iraqi state itself is allowing for humanitarian reasons, because there are people that have to be cared for, for this material that is being used in order to create this horrible system of tunnels, where now also the hostages are kept. Now, imagine this, and then imagine that this jihadi state would attack Iraq in the way that, apart from firing rockets at pleasure, but then they would also attack the Iraqi or any other state within which it would exist in the horrific way that Hamas did on the 7th of October. And then the Iraqi state would then decide to put an end to this jihadi state. Now, what would it have taken to take such a fortress? I think there is simply no analogy in history. There are many powerful armies that you fight. There are many cities that were destroyed by siege or by storm. Now, that is true. But I don't think there is any analogy, there is any precedent for a jihadist, for a terrorist army that is at the service of a jihadi state. And you don't want to invade it, but you can also not really subject it to a siege. Israel was not allowed to do to an actively hostile jihadi state in Gaza what the international community did to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, not during actual warfare, but after ceasefire, as part of the international recognized sanctions. And if you want to talk about humanitarian problems, go back to the rhetoric of thousands of Iraqi children that are, of course, whose deaths are, of course, the responsibility of the American government or of Tony Blair, never of Saddam Hussein. Never. Saddam Hussein was never responsible. It was also always the Western government.
Thank you, Alexander. I think we've used our time today. So I think it was a fantastic interview. Thank you very much for your time. I think in particular the the whole last answer that you gave around the question of the genocide charge, we should transcribe and we should clip and we should circulate, because it's I'm not sure how many Israelis might be difficult for you to understand from a
I don't think
distance.
anyone was ever accused of genocide as a result of urban warfare. Everyone, I mean, that there is genocide is usually other things. Okay.
Yeah, it's becoming so widely accepted here, and I think it will become more widely accepted when Amnesty International, which is not the organization it was, releases its report. But thanks very much again for being with us today. We hugely appreciate it, and we speak again soon.
Thank you.